Welcome, one and all. Thanks so much for joining me. It's my pleasure to talk with you today about four key ideas. Race. What is it? Who invented it? And what do we mean when we say race? Racism, which is what it's really all about. What is it and how do we combat it? Racialization. What is this theory? What does it mean and why should we use it? And language. How do we talk about these issues in order to bring an anti-racist world into being? My aim is to provide a concise synthesis of important ideas in a short workshop devoting only a few minutes to each theme. I hope this workshop is a good beginning for ongoing conversations. Email me with your questions and I will answer them privately, and then use frequently asked questions in forthcoming workshops. I hope what follows adds to what you already know. Take what's useful to you and leave the rest. To facilitate access, check out the timestamp for each specific section and consult the text in the PowerPoint for the sources of my discussion. Let's begin. A few important points to keep in mind before we start. Ideas of race are not timeless. That is, that they are made in particular times and places. And it's really important for us not to imagine that the ideas that we consider to be truth today were actually operating in the past. It's the context that gives meaning to ideas. And even in one context, multiple and competing ideas exist. Don't make assumptions, always check in. What do I know? How did I come to know it? And what particular systems do those ideas uphold? Race. What is it? Who invented it? What do we mean when we say race? Truthfully, it's complicated. To cut through the confusion, here's a brief but complicated history of the idea of race. I would say that there's at least two good answers to the question of when race was invented. Most scholars agree that race is an early modern European invention anchored in the 1500s alongside the rise of European imperial expansion and capitalism. Its writers were French, German, and English. Others suggest that the ideas we associate with race emerged in medieval Europe, particularly in England in 1218, when Jews were forced by law to wear clothing which distinguished them from Christians. Whether we anchor race with the emergence of the idea or with the emergence of the word, you might be surprised to know that in fact Christianity was central to its invention, circulation, and mobilization. First of all, the idea that the Irish were Christian in name but pagan in fact worked to authorize Henry II, the English monarch, with the blessing of Pope Adrian IV, to occupy Ireland. Christian theologians were also engaged in a quest to sever Christianity from its Jewish roots. It's the Catholic Church also that enabled European nations to claim lands belonging to non-Christians. And it's in their exploration of the world that was new to them that European Christians wrote about the peoples and cultures they encountered. But a caveat. We need to be clear that in the history that I've just drawn, the idea of race was actually developed to discuss pale-skinned Europeans. So it should be an important reminder to us that in fact, skin color is not a crucial sign of otherness. Ivan Hannaford, in his book Race, the History of an Idea in the West, credits the writers of the Enlightenment, a European philosophical movement and scientific revolution, with proliferating writings on race. Yet fascinatingly, German Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant's writings on race were actually meant to defend the Christian story of monogenesis, that is, the single creation or source of man in the Garden of Eden. Robert Bernasconi, the scholar who gives Kant pride of place in defining race, also acknowledges that a lot of what Kant wrote was stupid and problematic. I'm making an argument here that the age of reason and science cannot be entirely disentangled from Christianity, as some Christian European writers have tried to do. Following Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist who classified plants, animals, and minerals in his 1735 book, ethnographers and physical anthropologists entered the fashion of taxonomy to classify what they called, quote unquote, different kinds of man. Georges Cuvier, a French comparative anatomist, gave us three classifications: Caucasian, Mongolian, and Ethiopian, and then Johann Friedrich Blumenbach between 1793 and 1795 gave us these five classifications: Caucasian, Mongolian, Malay. Blumenbach was the father of craniology, that is, the scientific study of skulls. Cuvier and Blumenbach invented these types or varieties of man by assuming that one human skull was representative of all skulls of that human group, using dubious methods of skull measurements and including what they considered to be the quote unquote beauty and ugliness of skulls. I kid you not. Like Kant, Cuvier was a monogenicist who believed that Adam and Eve were quote unquote Caucasian and the original man, and Blumenbach's Caucasian was what Terence Kehl has called a secular Adam. For Terence Kehl, scientific theories of race are an extension of Christian intellectual history. This problematic category, Caucasian, might suggest a unified category, but 19th century writings and publications on the so-called races of man by Scottish Robert Knox, French Arthur Gobineau, Britain's Houston Stewart Chamberlain all hierarchically ranked distinct European races. Blumenbach's Caucasian excluded Finns, for instance, and his beautiful Caucasian skull actually belonged to an enslaved young woman from the Caucasus. Interestingly, it's only in the 19th century that biologists take up the work to find evidence in the body to support the claims made by these and other writers. We often assume that race is biological, but race as biology was only invented in the mid 19th century. And even then, scientists, try though they might, could not find race in the body. More importantly, perhaps, although scientists came up short, the idea of race had entered into popular language, into popular culture, and had taken on a life of its own. 20th century ideas of race are no less splintered than what had come before. By the early 20th century, some scholars abandoned the category of race because it had no real referent. The word could not be attached to anything tangible. By the 1930s, some scholars use the language of population or ethnicity, that is, social and cultural norms, to do the analytic work that race had done before. Others turned to eugenics and various practices and policies of sterilization or extermination of peoples who they considered to be quote unquote inferior. We would hope that the Holocaust would have proven the devastating consequences of this race thinking. But those ideas either went underground or came back in through the side door in the respectable form of genetic science. Genetic science might be a lot of things, but we need to be clear that genes do not correlate to phenotypes or the markers we might think of as race. In the late 20th century, it might appear as if something entirely different is going on. But as the brilliant scholar Kim Tallbear has shown, DNA science is actually founded on the ideas of separate human races based on categories first invented in the 18th and 19th centuries. So, at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century, not only have we not seen the end of race, now for a price and a sample of our DNA, and I certainly discourage people from doing this, companies promise to identify your race, even though the Human Genome Project has shown that all human beings are 99.9% the same, that human beings actually all share the same genome. For over a century, some scientists have argued that race should be consigned to the dustbin of history. By the end of the 20th century, it appeared like the rejection of race in science was almost complete. Barbara Fields actually put it in this way. Anyone who continues to believe in race as a physical attribute of individuals, despite the now commonplace disclaimers of biologists and geneticists, might as well believe that Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, and the Tooth Fairy are real. These are the facts. But race is not about facts. Race is about ideas. Race is what some scholars now call a social construction. Exactly what do we mean when we say race now and in the past? People have used the term to mean many different things, from kinship to distinctions between nations to economic classes within a given nation to human populations. The term race is so elastic, so malleable, it can mean anything. That's why the brilliant cultural critic Stuart Hall called it a floating signifier. The idea of race can be constituted in many different ways, depending on the intention and understanding of the person using the word. So why does it all matter? Wendy Chun suggests that instead of hand-wringing over what race is, we might do better to ask what race does. It's not race, whether it exists or not. It's racism that matters. Racism exists. Moreover, in what seems like a startling twist, some scholars argue that racism creates race rather than the other way around. In the words of Matthew Fry Jacobson, the power of racial suspicion generates racial objects. That means that it's a racist imagination that imagines that human beings can be separable by these categories of race. Racism can take many different kinds of forms, all of them historical and mutating. Racisms include, but are not limited to, anti-Black racisms, anti-Asian racisms, anti-Arab racisms, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, environmental racism, cultural racism. These racisms are not reducible. They do not share a common origin or source. Racisms are structural, ideological, social, economic, political. They can be overt, covert, tacit. They involve othering, marginalization, exploitation, and dispossession. Timothy Stanley suggests that racisms involve exclusion from particular territories, spaces, access to wealth, material goods, from particular statuses, and political power. Racism is also about exclusion from healthcare, clean water, the necessities of life, and sometimes from life itself. For Stanley, racism is about exclusion from being represented in particular ways, from having your own representations taken seriously. Racism is evident in forms of knowledge, what counts as art, as literature, and as truth. Perhaps it goes without saying from all I've said so far, but I want to be clear. We make an error to imagine that racism is solely thriving in the alt-right, KKK, neo-Nazis, or right-wing populist movements. To consign racism elsewhere absolves the mainstream, the center, the institutions, knowledge, popular culture. It mystifies how racism operates in our heads, in our hearts, in our relations with each other, because we live in a society structured by racism. As Timothy Stanley has argued, racism actually is part of the texture of life because we live in a racist society. One important example might be a good beginning. Non-natives who live on indigenous territories, that is, the lands now known as Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, all non-natives on those lands can become home and landowners because the indigenous peoples of those lands are dispossessed from their lands and resources. This is an outcome of structural and ideological racism. Structural because it's facilitated by the state and by the law and all the institutions that uphold both, and it's ideological because settlers do not think it is unethical and immoral to dispossess indigenous people in order for them to have the land. In fact, it is taken as natural and normal by settlers and their descendants that Canada is a white possession, and that in fact Canada has a reputation of being a virtuous nation despite the fact that it is established on the dispossession of indigenous peoples. So racism is a hierarchical ordering of bodies and beings, of ideas associated with particular bodies, in which some bodies and their practices, their societies, are deemed as more important, superior, better, moral, kinder, more humane, refined, more developed than other bodies. In this way, racism is about the justification of dispossession, exploitation, marginalization, criminalization, impoverishment, punishment, and death. It's not that racism is essential to any of those practices. Racism is just one modern mechanism for those practices. These ideologies and practices are produced and reinforced in a context of inequality. That means that the bodies, practices, and societies that are deemed superior and are valued, honored as good, pure, and ethical are actually the bodies that are doing the evaluating, the naming, and the representing. In an added twist, by virtue of that goodness and ethics, these bodies and societies are trusted with the lives of people who are less valued, inferiorized, exploited, and dispossessed. White supremacy and racism also involve inversion and projection. I offer these as examples and as a framework for you to use moving forward as an analytic lens. For instance, in 2012, 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Florida was killed by George Zimmerman, who was found not guilty. In 2016, 22-year-old Colton Bushy of the Cree Red Pheasant First Nation was fatally shot by Gerald Stanley on Treaty 6 land. Stanley, too, was acquitted. In these cases, the killers maintained that these young people that they gunned down were a threat. But consider who was armed, who got killed, who lived, who got acquitted. All of it upheld by a fantasy of white innocence, a white supremacist fantasy of whiteness as innocence, as bell hooks has argued, in which the other is cast as a threat, wherein the truth is that whiteness is about terror. We see that especially in Canada. For instance, in 2014, Michael Brown, 18 years old, was gunned down by police officer Darren Wilson in Missouri. Wilson was not charged with any crime. 1 month later, in September of 2014, Jermaine Carby was killed by police officer Ryan Reed in Ontario. According to Sandra Hudson and Nusra Kogali, the Canadian media did not cover the case of Carby the same way that they covered the Michael Brown case. This is about a media complicity in Canada's false vision of itself as tolerant, multiculturalism, and racist-free, where Canada and Canadian media look in a different direction lest something reprehensible be discovered from within. In all of these cases, the racist imagination considers racism elsewhere, sees non-whites as a threat. But in fact, in these and so many other cases, as we saw even in the recent attempted coup on the US Capitol, whites terrorize, but they project that terror onto others. As we have seen from the above examples, racialization is about assigning social meaning and value to all bodies. Some bodies are racialized with positive attributes, other bodies with negative attributes. Race is not about the body itself, but about the meanings that are assigned to bodies. So racialization refers to the historical and social processes of projecting meanings onto bodies. And as we've seen, those meanings have consequences. Racialization was developed by Robert Miles to analyze racism in order to destroy it without reifying race, meaning without making it appear as if race is real. We might assume that race is a social problem for which racism is an explanation, or conversely, that racism is a social problem for which race is the explanation. Instead, racism needs explanation, and racialization is an analytic lens to do that work. Race needs to be represented as a social process that needs to be explained rather than a social fact to explain other social facts. For Miles, as we've said, racialization is a social and historical process, and understanding it means turning our analysis to the social, political, and economic conditions which create, generate, assign, and reproduce those meanings. The theory of racialization moves our attention away from the body as a source of meaning and looks at the social context to explore how politics, power, economics gets written onto bodies so that over time, through repetition, reproduction, recirculation, those meanings come to be seen as natural, normal about the body itself. So paying attention to the context in which those meanings are attributed to bodies, looking at the way those meanings change over time, tells us that bodies themselves have no one inherent meaning. More importantly, we could see the work that race is doing in the world. So racialization is about attributing, assigning meaning to specific characteristics, both real and imagined. Symbols, sounds, words, phrases, signs, places, ideas, and practices can all be racialized. Racialization happens through the production of knowledge, as we saw above with our brief history of the idea of race. Through representation, cinema in the 20th century has been an important vehicle for circulating racist ideas. Racism does not show up in the same form all the time, and most recently, when it's at work, it may not even include the signs, language, and rhetoric that we associate with racism. In fact, it could be quite the opposite. For instance, Rusty Abo's analysis of Trudeau's newest strategy for so-called reconciliation with Indigenous nations demonstrates actually the continuity of the settler colonial project of assimilation and the attempted extinguishment of the inherent rights of Indigenous nations as sovereign on the lands Canada claims as its own. Rusty Abo, as a longtime activist, Mohawk insider, doesn't need a theory of racialization to understand what is at work with Trudeau's masquerading. Miles's theory of racialization helps us to get to that analysis if we don't have that insider knowledge, because racialization shows us how racism is ongoing through the consequences of the policies than in the expression of politicians who might sound like they're saying and doing all the right things, but the consequences for the people remain the same. Racialization helps us to understand that these discourses and practices are about the distribution of power. Racism are about the distribution of power, not about the body. Often the term racialized is used to refer to people of color, but critical whiteness studies show that all people are racialized in a racist society. To put it in the language of Ruth Frankenberg, to be racialized is to be structured by racist relations. I use Canada as an example because Canada is often considered outside of these racist relations of rule, which is in fact this fiction of white innocence and mythology. In Canada, at the beginning of the 20th century, middle class Anglo Saxon Protestants considered themselves to be the pinnacle of human civilization, and therefore they had the right to rule. They considered many other groups who are considered white today as not quite white, or unpreferred, or undesirable, including Ukrainians and other Eastern and Southern Europeans. Over the course of the first half of the 20th century, many of these formerly excluded groups came to be regarded as white, often having to sacrifice what made them culturally unique. But perhaps the most important key lesson regarding inclusion, something that is often presented as a solution to racism, is that in this case, inclusion of formerly excluded groups into whiteness actually worked to strengthen white supremacy rather than to challenge it. So racialization is always relational. It's always done in relation to other groups. It also can involve triangulation. That is, that some formerly marginalized groups may be conditionally included while others remain excluded. Ultimately, this is about power. These ideas were created by white supremacy and they work to try to uphold it. Racialization also happens through language. Timothy Stanley argues that language does not reflect race, language makes race. Language of racial difference does not record or document an objective reality of real, biological, social, or cultural differences. Rather, language creates those differences. Likewise, representations do not record pre-existing difference, they create difference. For instance, consider how using the term Caucasian to talk about white people gives it a veneer of science. Whereas, as James Baldwin has argued, white is a metaphor for power. That's a far more productive way of talking about race. We need to be able to talk about racism without reproducing the idea that there is such a thing as race. And that was what Miles was concerned with. One of the things he was concerned with was ways to talk about racism without reproducing and recirculating harmful ideas. If we do an anti-racist workshop where we ask participants to name racist ideas, we breathe new life into those ideas by uttering them. We need strategies to intervene, interrupt, to reimagine, to tell stories in new ways that acknowledge racism while working with every breath and action to undermine its power. As Albert Einstein has argued, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. A key strategy is to focus on who gains from racism. Often in discussions of racism, its victims are the only people in focus. For sure, acknowledging and bearing witness to the harms and suffering caused by racism is crucial. But the singularity of the lens may lead to the inference that there must be something wrong with those people. They're the only people in the frame. We need to widen our understanding to see that some people are disadvantaged in order for others to be advantaged. Timothy Stanley reminds us to always ask who is doing what to whom, and to look at who benefits, who profits, and who is privileged as a way of assigning responsibility. Racism and dispossession and its representations are also sometimes a form of racism, what has been named poverty porn. That means that those images are only part of the story, and staying focused on that part of the story is a kind of racism in its refusal to see the victims of racism as more than that, as subjects, agents, creators, resistors, in which racism is only a fragment of their stories, their lives, and possibilities. Resistors of racism also take up the language of race, work to reconstitute it, to reconfigure it, so that racism is always being challenged. It's always changing because it's always being challenged. And without taking into account challenges to racism by groups who are its targets, resistance is downplayed and the power of dominant groups is overestimated. These all may reinforce the myth that racism cannot be changed, all of which works to ensure the status quo. We need to be anti-racist rather than non-racist. Toni Morrison has argued that enforcing racelessness is itself a racial act. To see I don't see race is a way of saying I don't see systemic racism. Claiming not to be a racist in a racist society will not help to defeat racism because non racism suggests that racism has been overcome and deep social conditioning overthrown. Instead, Jay Smooth suggests we need to take a dental hygiene approach to anti racism rather than the tonsil removal paradigm. Dental hygiene requires constant maintenance rather than this non-racist tonsil removal paradigm, which suggests that the internal work of anti-racism can be done once and for all. To be anti-racist is to make a commitment to an ongoing fight to undo, to challenge racism with new practices, new stories, and new relations. Anti-racism is an ethical position focused on justice and respect. For an anti-racist future, we need to be open to learning new things, to unlearning the stories that we're attached to. Racism is normalized in film, literature, history, street names, statues in our society. Scholars have been trying to show us how ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, Christian supremacy have all shaped what counts as art, literature, philosophy. Anti-racism requires not only decentering those knowledge systems, as well as an ongoing analysis of how those knowledge systems and beliefs structure and inform the world we live in. Anti-racism requires us to tell the truth about ourselves and about our society. It will require new scripts and new stories, a revolution in our thinking and in our practices. It will require us to challenge those ideas which ensure the status quo. We all need to be responsible, able to respond. And the call is for justice, not inclusion in white supremacist, Christian supremacist, ableist, heterosexist, racist institutions. It's about changing political and economic relations. For settlers on indigenous territories, it will require massive restitution, including land back, financial transfers, compensation for past and ongoing injustices. It will require recognition and respect of Indigenous sovereignty. Respect. History is nobody's fault, but it is everybody's responsibility. True, we did not create these systems, but every day, unless we work to undermine them, we inadvertently support them. I hope this short workshop is a good beginning. I ask all of you to think about what you can do and what you will say to make a positive difference. The future depends on all of us. Thank you so much for listening and for your attention. I hope this short workshop is a good beginning. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.